Welcome back. Let's go right into it.
A legacy revisited. Donald Trump's release of JFK assassination documents. The year was 2025, but the spark that ignited the nation came from an event long buried in the shadows of history: the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. For decades, Americans had lived with an official story. A lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted independently. That conclusion, delivered by the Warren Commission, had long been challenged by skeptics, conspiracy theorists, and even a few historians. But the mystery had remained largely untouched by anything conclusive. Then, unexpectedly, Donald Trump stepped into the picture once more, not as president, but as a private citizen with an unrelenting grip on media attention and public imagination. In early 2024, Trump announced through his own media network that he would be releasing the full, uncensored JFK assassination files, what he called the Pandora File. He claimed the documents had been passed to him through whistleblowers, buried in forgotten vaults of government storage, shielded from public eyes for decades by entrenched officials. When asked how he came to possess the documents, Trump only said, "I have people who know things. Incredible patriots. They wanted the truth out. So we're doing what the government never had the guts to do." Skeptics rolled their eyes. But when scanned PDFs of thousands of pages hit the internet through multiple sources, including independent journalists, foreign media outlets, and Trump's own streaming app, the reaction was immediate. These weren't recycled conspiracy theories from fringe websites. They were internal memos, intelligence dispatches, transcripts, photos, and marginal notes in official handwriting. The National Archives refused to confirm their authenticity, but linguistic and forensic experts began to weigh in. Many of the documents matched archival formatting, watermarks, and even paper aging indicators from the 1960s. One document stood out: a CIA field report detailing a program referred to as Operation Eden. The report described a contingency plan drawn up in mid-1962 in response to Kennedy's increasingly independent foreign policy moves. The memo warned that Kennedy's resistance to escalating military presence in Vietnam, his outreach to Castro for back-channel diplomacy, and his push to dismantle covert CIA operations could be perceived as destabilizing national security protocols. Buried in a footnote was a chilling line: "In extreme scenarios, preservation of institutional stability must override individual leadership volatility." Another revelation came from a set of surveillance records documenting Lee Harvey Oswald's trip to Mexico City weeks before the assassination. A summary of an intercepted communication between Oswald and a Soviet diplomat referred to the package to be delivered in Dallas. The document was flagged as unreliable by CIA analysts at the time, yet the newly surfaced files included internal notes questioning that dismissal. As the media frenzy grew, forensic teams discovered matching elements between the newly released files and those kept in official repositories. Handwriting comparisons confirmed that certain annotations had been made by Kennedy's own secretary. One undelivered speech draft, recovered from a hidden envelope, bore the title, "The Secret Societies We Must End," and spoke ominously of institutions that have replaced public will with shadow governance. Trump's detractors called the release irresponsible, a political stunt to destabilize public trust in U.S. institutions. His supporters, however, saw it as a long-awaited vindication. "They called us crazy," one talk show host said, "but now we have receipts." The documents also implicated international players. A French intelligence operative reported seeing Oswald meeting with Cuban exiles in Paris in early 1963. A declassified Soviet document from the same year stated that the KGB considered Oswald too unstable to recruit, fearing he was an American intelligence decoy. Yet, a back-channel telegram sent to Moscow referred cryptically to stagecraft November 22nd, suggesting that knowledge of the Dallas event might have extended beyond U.S. borders. Inside academic circles, the reaction was cautious but curious. Ellen Merrick, a well-respected professor of modern U.S. history at Harvard, spent weeks analyzing the files with her research team. A longtime defender of the Warren Commission, she now found herself questioning long-held assumptions. One of her students pointed out a peculiar phrase that appeared in several internal FBI communications: Dallas contingency. It wasn't in any prior public record. The phrase reappeared in a memorandum written by a young George H.W. Bush during his brief but now confirmed tenure with the CIA. In it, he described the growing internal concern over Kennedy's administration becoming an existential conflict for intelligence continuity. Bush would later deny having knowledge of the assassination, but this memo offered a murkier view of his early career. As the public consumed the files, historians and political analysts scrambled to address the implications. What did it mean if powerful institutions had at the very least anticipated a threat to their agenda, and at worst, facilitated the elimination of the president? Trump appeared nightly on his own media outlet, boasting that this is the most important truth-telling event in American history. His critics saw opportunism, a manipulation of the narrative to amplify distrust and elevate his legacy. But even among his opponents, few could deny the impact. The files had reignited national memory. Every television show, every classroom discussion, every dinner table conversation seemed to orbit the same question: what really happened in Dallas? Meanwhile, in South America, a retired CIA asset named Louis Grantham was tracked down by investigative reporters. Living under a false name, Grantham confirmed that he had been stationed in Dallas during the week of the assassination. "We weren't told much," he admitted, "just to watch for any foreign entanglements." But it wasn't a clean operation. There were whispers of a parallel mission, one not on the official books. When asked who ordered it, Grantham remained silent. "It wasn't a president," he finally said. "It was something older than that." That phrase, "older than that," took on mythic status in the weeks that followed. Social media was flooded with amateur sleuths pouring through the files. Photographs were digitally enhanced, handwriting analyzed, patterns cross-referenced with other Cold War archives. The public was no longer content with passive curiosity. This was no longer about Oswald. It was about a system and whether it had ever truly been under civilian control. The implications spread like cracks through the glass of national mythology. Television anchors debated whether the government had ever fully regained control of its own intelligence apparatus after the war. Popular podcasts started featuring historians who had once been ignored or dismissed. Polls showed that more than 70% of Americans now believe Kennedy was killed as part of a broader conspiracy, a number not seen since the 1970s. Museums rushed to update exhibits. School boards debated whether to include the new documents in the curriculum. Political candidates on both sides scrambled to recalibrate their positions. For some, the files represented the beginning of a new American reckoning. For others, they were simply fuel for the flames of populist revolt. As the dust settled, one thing became clear. History was no longer a settled matter, and the past, long buried under decades of official silence, had finally clawed its way into the present. The shockwaves from the document release didn't fade. They deepened. Within weeks, a bipartisan congressional committee was formed under public pressure, tasked with examining the authenticity, content, and implications of the leaked files. The hearings were broadcast live, drawing millions of viewers daily, riveted by testimony from former CIA analysts, retired FBI agents, and historians now caught in the whirlwind of a reawakened past. The committee itself quickly split into factions. Some argued that the files should never have been made public, that they endangered current operatives and relationships with foreign intelligence. Others insisted the American people had a right to know, regardless of how long ago the events had occurred. Tensions escalated when it was revealed that some of the files were stored in off-books facilities during the Bush and Clinton administrations, never logged into the official National Archives. Even more damning was the revelation that a small, elite team, dubbed informally as the Custodians, had been managing and updating a secret ledger of sensitive Cold War operations. The ledger, referenced in several of the Pandora File documents, appeared to include code names, dates, and brief descriptions of covert actions, some of which aligned with known historical crises, while others, Midnight Clover, Operation Chimera, Novice Silence, had no clear referent. For the average citizen, it was like watching a thriller unfold in real time. For researchers like Ellen Merrick, it was something else entirely, a lifelong academic focus unraveling in front of her. In one of her published op-eds, she wrote, "These documents don't just change our understanding of the JFK assassination. They rewrite the narrative architecture of post-war American power. There was one file that particularly unsettled her. A transcript from a private meeting held on November 20th, 1963, just 2 days before Kennedy's death. Present were 3 unnamed intelligence officials and a man referred to only as Mr. X. The discussion involved contingency plans in case domestic policy reversal became imminent. The participants discussed utilizing Oswald as a variable already in play and speculated whether alternate delivery methods could be prepared. The phrase alternate delivery methods appeared 4 more times in other files, always redacted in context, but it began to take on a sinister weight in the public's imagination. Internet forums, podcasts, and cable pundits exploded with theories. Was Oswald simply a pawn? Was there a second shooter, as so many had claimed? Or was the assassination merely the most visible symptom of something deeper, more structural, a coup of ideology rather than arms? While mainstream news anchors tried to maintain journalistic neutrality, the narrative kept slipping out of their hands. Younger generations, far removed from Cold War paranoia, found the whole ordeal both fascinating and disillusioning. Many questioned whether democracy had ever fully functioned in the way their civics books described. Then came the phone call logs. Newly surfaced, never-before-seen telephone transcripts between Johnson, Hoover, and a list of unnamed intermediaries showed a rush of activity in the 48 hours leading up to the assassination. One line, buried in a memo summary, read, "If we can't prevent his withdrawal plan, we must contain the consequences." That withdrawal plan, as every historian knew, referred to Kennedy's intention to begin pulling troops out of Vietnam. Another memo contained notes on a classified CID joint meeting where the economic impact of withdrawal was analyzed. The conclusion, destabilizing. Potential loss of strategic manufacturing advantage. The files also revealed that Kennedy had begun seeking alternate channels to gather intelligence, bypassing both the CIA and NSA in favor of his brother Robert's private envoys. That move alone had rattled the traditional intelligence community. Several insiders feared it would expose operations unrelated to the assassination, operations that had been ongoing since the Eisenhower era. Among these was Project Hadrian, a now-exposed program that tracked domestic political figures for signs of ideological deviation. The files painted a picture of a government that, beneath its surface, was in quiet war with itself. Trump's continued involvement only complicated matters. Though no longer president, he inserted himself as the chief narrator of this unfolding saga. His nightly monologues weren't just commentary. They were a mixture of victory laps and open provocation. They tried to bury the truth, he declared in one widely circulated clip. "I dug it up, and now everyone sees it. What else have they lied to you about?" His approval ratings among populist circles soared. For others, his actions seemed dangerously destabilizing. But whether out of fear, awe, or reluctant admiration, even critics admitted Trump had changed the game. As lawsuits flew between intelligence agencies and whistleblower protection groups, and the Biden-appointed CIA director submitted her resignation, one final batch of documents appeared online, released by a group calling itself the Archive Defiant. These documents weren't about JFK directly, but they completed a circle. They described a set of simulations conducted between 1960 and 1965, testing the effects of political assassinations on national morale, market stability, and public trust. One simulation, dated March 1963, modeled the assassination of a sitting president in Dallas and the deployment of a single gunman narrative. The simulation's conclusion was chillingly pragmatic. Optimal outcome achieved in 76% of trials. Narrative consolidation possible within 24 months. That was the tipping point. Public opinion began to shift from skeptical curiosity to outright belief that Kennedy's assassination was more than a tragic historical moment. It was an engineered turning point. And more than that, it was the point where the official story and the truth began living entirely separate lives. Ellen Merrick stood before a packed auditorium at Stanford, giving a lecture broadcast live across the world. "We've reached a new historical phase," she said. "Not one where we uncover the truth, but where we accept that it was kept from us, intentionally, strategically, and for longer than we dared imagine." A student asked her whether knowing the truth made any real difference now, decades later. She paused, then answered, "History isn't about fixing the past. It's about how we live with it, and how we keep it from repeating itself, or worse, from being rewritten again by those who seek power without memory. Outside the hall, demonstrators gathered, waving both American flags and signs with Kennedy's face over the words, "Justice delayed is justice denied." For many, it was no longer about JFK alone. It was about reclaiming ownership of history and reasserting control over a government they now viewed with weary suspicion. The files had done what years of films, books, and speculation never could. They had opened a wound that had never really healed and shown that it hadn't been a scar. It had been a bandage over something still festering. The story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. More documents were said to exist. Whistleblowers began hinting at a second cache, this one dealing with events that followed Kennedy's death, the Robert Kennedy assassination, Watergate, even the attempted Reagan shooting. The public was listening now, watching, demanding. And somewhere in Florida, Donald Trump leaned back in a gold-trimmed chair, smiling to himself, as the headlines flashed across the screen. Pandora's box opened. America demands answers. He didn't need to say a word. He already had. The gravity of the revelations continued to pull the nation inward. Congress, still in session under a special mandate, extended its hearings into the fall. Whistleblowers, emboldened by public support and the seeming collapse of old norms, began to emerge from the shadows. Some spoke through encrypted video streams. Others testified behind closed doors. A few appeared publicly, faces drawn but defiant. Among them was Julian Mercer, a retired NSA analyst who claimed to have been part of a post-assassination review program codenamed Athena. According to Mercer, Athena's sole purpose was to gather internal chatter within U.S. intelligence agencies after November 22, 1963, to monitor morale, leak potential, and political loyalty among agents. "We were more afraid of exposure than another assassin," Mercer testified. The priority wasn't national healing. It was narrative lockdown. His testimony was followed by the leak of a confidential 1964 Pentagon document stating that the public must be nudged toward closure, not curiosity. Mercer's voice broke as he read it aloud on camera. "We were told to make sure people moved on. If someone asked too many questions, we had ways to redirect them." The public reaction was electric. Protests erupted in major cities, not against the current administration, but against the legacy of secrecy. Across college campuses, walls were painted with the now iconic phrase from the leaked documents, "older than that." It had become a cultural slogan, shorthand for the deep-rooted, shadowed systems many now believed governed American life. But not everyone was eager to confront the implications. Major institutions, media conglomerates, defense contractors, and intelligence veterans began pushing back, warning of a coming historical collapse. A prominent former CIA director went on record saying, "If the public truly digests everything in those files, our entire post-war history becomes negotiable." That's not just dangerous, that's annihilating. Despite such resistance, the files kept delivering shockwaves. One batch included surveillance photos of a meeting between Lyndon Johnson and senior military advisors the night before the assassination. The images, long thought lost, showed a whiteboard with several key terms legible: Bay of Pigs, withdrawal acceleration, agency contingency. It wasn't definitive proof of foreknowledge, but the context was damning enough to push conspiracy into plausibility. A chilling document appeared shortly after, an unclassified draft titled Crisis Benefits Evaluation, 1963 to 1965. Authored by an internal think tank later absorbed into DARPA, it estimated projected boosts in defense spending, intelligence agency funding, and national security legislation in the event of a presidential martyrdom linked to Cold War tensions. According to the authors, such an event would provide an accelerated unifying effect and reinvigorate American exceptionalism under centralized command narratives. The public's faith in foundational institutions was evaporating. Gallup and Pew Research surveys showed that over 80% of Americans now believe Kennedy was killed as part of a conspiracy. What varied was how they processed that belief. For some, it bred cynicism. For others, urgency. Grassroots initiatives formed overnight, citizens demanding full transparency on every Cold War-era operation, pushing for a Truth and Reconciliation-style commission. Political candidates, left and right, began integrating JFK justice into their platforms. It wasn't just policy anymore. It was moral identity. Ellen Merrick, now the reluctant face of the academic response, spoke on a panel broadcast globally. We are witnessing the great unraveling of American post-war mythology. This isn't about proving every detail. It's about acknowledging that we were lied to, systematically, and for a purpose. Some worried the country couldn't hold under the weight of such disillusionment. The Pentagon released a rare joint statement, affirming that our national defense structure remains aligned with democratic oversight. The wording was oddly defensive, as though designed less for reassurance than to preempt panic. Meanwhile, foreign governments watched with sharpened eyes. Russian state media aired nightly specials mocking America's illusion of transparency. China called it an overdue reckoning with the costs of imperial hypocrisy. But in Europe, especially France and Germany, sympathy grew. Their own archives were suddenly under scrutiny, spurred by a sense that if the United States could hide this much, what might they have done? The Vatican released a rare communiqué acknowledging it had received unsolicited documents after the assassination, implying a global awareness of something larger than a lone shooter. No details followed. In Dallas, the assassination site saw a dramatic increase in visitors. Flowers, candles, and letters littered Dealey Plaza. A replica of Kennedy's final speech, the one he never delivered in Dallas, was posted on walls and billboards across the city. The speech, found among the Pandora Files in a folder marked Black Tulip, was hopeful, unifying, and heartbreakingly idealistic. Its closing line haunted readers. We must steer this great nation not only with strength, but with memory. For what we forget, we may one day become. The speech became a rallying cry for a generation that felt robbed not just of truth, but of what could have been. Donald Trump continued to assert his role in breaking the dam. He released a book titled I Told You So: Power, Secrets, and the Lies They Feed You, blending personal commentary with excerpts from the files. The book sold millions of copies. His critics denounced it as opportunism. His supporters saw it as redemption. But the undeniable fact remained. He had ignited a cultural shift. There was talk now, serious talk, of reinvestigating the assassinations of both John and Robert Kennedy under a newly authorized citizen tribunal. Not just through government, but with participation from historians, journalists, and vetted researchers. The goal was not prosecution, but disclosure. At one such planning summit, a gray-haired man in a simple suit stood to speak. He had once worked for naval intelligence. He said nothing of who gave the orders. He only said this: some of us knew, some of us didn't want to know, and some of us prayed it wouldn't matter. But it did. It always did. There was silence in the room. And then, from the back, someone asked the question on everyone's mind. If they could do it then, what makes us think they ever stopped? Public confidence had fractured into something unrecognizable, not outright panic, but a disquiet so widespread it became background noise. The kind of quiet that filled living rooms after the nightly news when no one quite knew what to say anymore. People had stopped asking, "Is it true?" They had started asking, "What else?" And indeed, what else was coming? A second drop of documents appeared, this time not from Trump, not from any agency, but uploaded anonymously to a private university server in Belgium. These were different. They weren't internal memos or transcripts. They were operational logs, mission briefings, decoded messages, redacted orders with the black bars removed. And most shockingly, autopsy overlays that didn't match the official medical report. Two forensic pathologists, one from Canada and one from the UK, reviewed them. Both confirmed the same. The entry and exit wounds detailed in these files contradicted the Warren Commission's single-bullet theory in multiple fatal ways. This time, there was no walking it back. No alternative interpretation. These were primary records. Some were signed by names now long dead, others by initials that matched still-living former operatives. And as journalists began tracking them down, a few spoke, carefully, but definitively. I was young. I followed orders. It wasn't what you think, but it also wasn't what they told you. One former CIA asset, now 90, confessed during an off-camera interview. Kennedy made enemies because he wanted to change things no one wanted changed. It wasn't personal. It was structural. Structural. That word kept surfacing. on talk shows, academic journals, protest placards. This wasn't about rogue actors or secret cabals anymore. It was about the machinery of a system that had evolved to self-protect. And in 1963, the machine had spun its gears. Even the entertainment industry couldn't resist. A wave of documentaries, dramatizations, and interactive experiences flooded streaming platforms. A popular show allowed users to play through alternative timelines. What might have happened had JFK lived? Had he pulled out of Vietnam? Had RFK followed him into the Oval Office? The irony wasn't lost on anyone. For decades, the assassination had been fictionally dissected. Now, when the truth emerged, it was being gamified. But the appetite was insatiable. People didn't just want truth, they wanted immersion. They wanted to inhabit a world where they had control over history, even virtually. And yet, amid all this noise, a quiet shift began taking place in Washington. A new bill, the National Transparency Reform Act, passed narrowly in the House. It mandated full declassification of Cold War intelligence operations within 10 years, with exceptions only for ongoing threats. A Senate version followed, stronger and less forgiving. Though not yet law, its very existence was a signal the dam had truly cracked. Behind the scenes, however, not everyone was on board. A shadowy memorandum began circulating, printed, not digital. It warned of narrative destabilization and proposed constructive historical reinforcement. According to investigative journalist Nina Baird, this memo was authored by a private intelligence consortium, a mix of former agency officials and defense contractors, acting unofficially but with alarming reach. Their plan was to reassert a sanitized coherence through educational channels, public programming, and strategic fact-correction campaigns. They wanted to slowly rebuild the myth, not with lies this time, but with selective framing. Truth is what survives long enough to be taught, the memo said. It was a sophisticated pushback, more subtle than denial. It didn't reject the new truth, it just worked to dull its edges, confuse it, dilute it, make it seem overwhelming and therefore irrelevant. But it was too late for that. Whistleblowers from the Air Force, Navy intelligence, and even the Postal Inspection Service, which had handled sensitive communications in the 1960s, continued to come forward. Their stories were granular, often unrelated to JFK directly, but they confirmed one thing again and again. There had been a culture of silent compliance, a network of compartmentalized duty that kept too many people from asking why they were doing what they were doing. One such witness, a retired cryptologist named Valerie Simmons, described working on intercepted communications in the days before and after the assassination. We saw things. Orders rerouted. Stations go dark, then return under new call signs. Everything got ghosted, like we were watching pieces of a story vanish in real time. And then came the twist no one expected. A final set of documents, unmarked, appeared on the desk of a junior staffer at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. They were accompanied by a simple handwritten note. You've all been looking in the wrong place. These files weren't from the CIA or FBI. They were from an internal security group attached to the Federal Reserve. Their contents were mundane at first: economic forecasts, meeting minutes, foreign currency notes. But tucked among them was a briefing marked Eyes Only, November 15, 1963. It laid out a contingency for asset preservation in the event of executive transition. It spoke of market insurance measures and stability interventions. The tone was cool, mathematical. A presidency was a variable, a risk profile, a known volatility. The implications were staggering. Not just that political actors knew something was coming, but that financial actors had modeled it. No wonder the market had stabilized so quickly after Kennedy's death. No wonder defense stocks soared in the weeks that followed. It hadn't been resilience. It had been preparation. This revelation exploded into the headlines. Not just a conspiracy of violence or ideology, but of capital, profit. People began asking, not if Kennedy was killed by his enemies, but if he was simply no longer useful to the systems that ran beneath everything. Deeper than government, quieter than any agency. A national reckoning was now fully underway. Textbooks were rewritten, memorials erected. A new federal office, the Historical Integrity Commission, was created, tasked with managing future declassifications with civilian oversight. Transparency, it seemed, was now politically viable. And in homes across the country, people sat down at dinner tables, staring at the echoes of history finally heard. Not everyone found closure. Not everyone wanted it. But the country had crossed a threshold. It could no longer pretend it hadn't. Fall faded into winter, and America was no longer the same country it had been just a year prior. A psychic shift had occurred, subtle in some corners, radical in others, but undeniable everywhere. Streets still bustled, bills still passed, holidays still came. But underneath, people moved differently, lived differently, thought differently. A phrase had emerged in popular culture, born from a journalist's offhand remark on a late-night panel. Post-truth America is still America, just awake now. Across the heartland, small towns hosted truth nights at local libraries. People brought their own research, family records, faded photos, even cassette recordings from parents and grandparents who had lived through that chaotic era. The events weren't driven by political parties or media groups, just ordinary citizens trying to reclaim their place in history. And for the first time in generations, young people were listening to their elders, not out of politeness, but out of a burning need to understand what had been lost, what had been hidden, and what might still be lurking beneath the surface. On college campuses, new courses exploded in popularity: clandestine governance and Cold War myth, the sociology of concealment, media as memory. These weren't conspiracy theory seminars. These were rigorous, multidisciplinary attempts to process an unbearable truth. The American narrative had never been just one story. And through it all, Trump maintained his role as unlikely catalyst. Though no longer president, he remained on the scene, appearing on podcasts, in interviews, and at high-profile summits where historians, tech leaders, and former operatives debated what came next. Some hated him for politicizing the release. Others begrudgingly credited him with breaking a silence no one else had dared disturb. In a rare moment of bipartisan honesty, a congressional roundtable was held without press access. It was called the Kennedy Reckoning. Lawmakers from both parties spoke openly, not about Trump or even Kennedy, but about the systems they had inherited. "We are the children of silence," said Senator Howard Leon of Illinois. "And now that the silence is broken, we need to raise something better in its place." What better looked like remained uncertain. There were calls for deeper investigations into other Cold War-era events: the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the FBI surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., the origins of covert operations in Latin America. Some wanted everything opened at once. Others feared institutional collapse. One proposal, gaining traction, was a 10-year Truth Arc initiative, a staged release of classified material, with civilian review boards and AI-powered authenticity tracking. No more anonymous leaks. No more mysterious documents on university servers. If America was to face its past, it would do so deliberately, responsibly, and publicly. But not all wounds healed evenly. In Miami, a retired Cuban exile leader held a press conference to deny any involvement in plots against Kennedy. He read from a letter addressed to the youth of tomorrow, warning them against embracing easy villains. "Revolution," he said, "is always untidy. But history is not a courtroom. It is a mirror." Elsewhere, the conversation turned darker. Fringe groups, some far-right, others far-left, used the revelations to justify extremist agendas. They spun narratives of permanent deep state control, of citizen militias as the only answer. A federal building in Idaho was vandalized with the words, "He wasn't the last." Law enforcement quietly upped security around key officials. The FBI issued an internal memo noting a steep rise in ideologically motivated revisionism. The Kennedy family remained mostly quiet. Caroline issued a short, elegant statement through the JFK library. "My father believed in transparency, accountability, and courage in leadership. If this moment allows America to reflect more honestly on its past and rise more faithfully toward its ideals, then that is the legacy he would want, not of power, but of truth." The words echoed across the airwaves, quoted in editorials, remixed in protest chants, and projected onto buildings in New York and Boston. Even in international circles, the tremors continued. Germany declassified certain Cold War files to show solidarity. Australia followed. The UK remained hesitant. A leaked MI6 memo described the American disclosures as a dangerous precedent for for operational security and public trust. Privately, however, officials admitted they feared similar reckonings of their own. In classrooms across the U.S., teachers were left scrambling. Textbooks had become obsolete in under a year. A temporary national curriculum, dubbed History in Flux, was adopted by over 30 states. It encouraged critical thinking over chronology, context over conclusions. Students were taught to ask, who wrote this? Why? What wasn't said? For many, it was exhilarating. For others, destabilizing. But no one could say it wasn't working. The conversation even reached space, metaphorically and literally. In an unexpected twist, NASA released internal documents showing how the moon landing's messaging had been shaped by Cold War optics, including direct quotes from a 1965 internal PR memo. Kennedy's death must be eclipsed by American triumph. The moon will be our exclamation mark. The memo sparked laughter, outrage, and fascination. More importantly, it humanized the machine, revealing how institutions, even in moments of greatness, had been wrestling with grief, guilt, and global optics. Late-night comedians had a field day. One joked, "Turns out we went to the moon because America needed a hug." Another added, "The only thing more classified than the JFK files was why cafeteria meatloaf was allowed in schools." Humor became a national coping tool, but beneath the laughter was an ache, a quiet longing for something lost. Not innocence, that had been gone for decades, but maybe faith. Faith that the system, while flawed, wasn't fundamentally rigged, that its sins were errors, not features. In the months that followed, something extraordinary happened. A group of high school students from Detroit created an open-source JFK archive app. It allowed users to view the released files, cross-reference them with historical events, add annotations, and even vote on their interpretations. It went viral in less than a week. Within a month, it had 5 million downloads. Soon, classrooms began using the app. College researchers contributed citations. A decentralized, living record had formed, not curated by the government, but by the people. And just like that, a new form of history emerged, participatory, dynamic, transparent. Trump, watching the developments from Mar-a-Lago, posted on Truth Social, "I told you, when the truth comes out, the people will rise. We're only getting started." For once, critics didn't mock him, because whether they liked it or not, the chain reaction he'd started was still unfolding. And this time, no one could stop it. America was learning, painfully and beautifully, how to remember again. Not through statues or ceremonies, but through courage. Spring arrived with an intensity America hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was just the season's normal rhythm. Maybe it was something deeper, a country beginning to thaw from decades of buried truths. Conversations once confined to late-night diners or conspiracy forums now unfolded in classrooms, courtrooms, and congressional hearings. The Truth Arc initiative was officially signed into law on a chilly morning in March. President Eleanor Keene, whose administration had largely remained hands-off during the initial document release, called it the most important transparency act in American history. Her pen hovered over the parchment for a moment before signing, as if the gravity of the moment demanded a breath of silence. The law mandated that all Cold War-era classified material, military, economic, intelligence, and diplomatic, be reviewed and scheduled for release within 10 years. It included funding for civilian oversight boards, artificial intelligence support systems to detect alterations or fabrications, and protection protocols for whistleblowers. It was a victory for transparency and a declaration that the old rules were no longer sacred. Across the nation, memorials began to change. In Dallas, Dealey Plaza saw a quiet transformation. Instead of static plaques and mournful statues, an open-air installation now invited visitors to explore the many versions of November 22, 1963. A long, curving wall presented official reports, eyewitness accounts, leaked memos, and speculative diagrams side by side. Here lies not one truth, but many fragments of it. The opening inscription read, "Truth is no longer what we're told. It's what we piece together." Visitors placed flowers, yes, but also QR codes linking to their family stories. A former Marine left his father's journal at the foot of the wall. A woman from Bogota uploaded an audio file of her grandfather's intercepted transmission from the days leading up to the assassination. The The line between memorial and archive dissolved. And the more people engaged, the more the narrative evolved. Media outlets ran weekly truth threads, public contributions to unraveling still murky historical events. One such thread helped trace the paper trail of a now-deceased intermediary between organized crime and a covert shipping operation run out of New Orleans in the 1960s. Another uncovered documents suggesting J. Edgar Hoover had personally suppressed early witness statements that contradicted the single bullet theory. But with every new revelation, the questions deepened. Not just what happened, but why did we believe what we did for so long? A growing chorus of psychologists, sociologists, and historians began to dig not into the facts themselves, but into America's long relationship with denial. A symposium at Stanford titled "The Comfort of Coherence" explored how national myths function like emotional scaffolding. Tear them down too quickly, and the psyche collapses. Tear them down too late, and rot sets in. One speaker, Dr. Celino Campo, put it plainly: the truth is rarely too heavy to carry. What breaks people is realizing they carried a lie for no reason. Her words resonated, not just with academics, but with everyday Americans suddenly confronting their inheritance. Veterans came forward with letters and journals never shared. Journalists unearthed editorials they'd once been told to kill. Families reopened boxes long kept sealed in attics. The ghosts of the past weren't just being acknowledged, they were being invited to speak. And slowly, something beautiful began to form. A new kind of patriotism, not the kind built on blind reverence or unshaken pride, but one rooted in resilience, in humility, in the painful, unflinching pursuit of truth. Flags still flew, songs were still sung, but they felt different now. Less about glory, more about grace. Schools updated their civics curriculum. Students no longer memorized historical dates in isolation. Instead, they were taught to ask, whose version of history is this? And who had the power to silence others? These weren't accusations, they were tools. A generation raised a question, not out of cynicism, but responsibility. Meanwhile, a new public project launched from a coalition of universities, libraries, and technologists, the Vault. It was the largest decentralized archive in the world, part blockchain, part public forum, part immersive museum. Within 6 months of launch, the Vault had absorbed more than 4 million documents, personal testimonies, and independently verified materials related to Cold War and post-war history. Visitors could navigate history through emotion, through location, through consequence. Want to trace fear? You'd see the Red Scare, COINTELPRO, atomic drills, and the Kennedy assassination side by side. Want to follow money? You'd see campaign donors, offshore accounts, defense contracts, and economic destabilization efforts across continents. Truth, finally, had dimension. And yet, not everyone welcomed the shift. A growing bloc within Congress, self-branded as the Pillars, began arguing that too much transparency could erode America's international leverage. They introduced a bill, the National Continuity Clause, that would allow the president to delay the release of certain documents deemed strategically destabilizing. It narrowly failed in the Senate, but the debate was telling. The old guard was regrouping. The narrative, once surrendered, was now a battleground. In response, protesters began gathering outside the National Archives every Friday. Peaceful, quiet, sometimes just a few dozen. They held signs that read, "No more secrets. Truth isn't treason. History belongs to us." Trump, meanwhile, continued to orbit the edges of the discourse, sometimes welcomed, sometimes resented. In an unexpected 60 Minutes interview, he reflected on his decision to release the JFK files. "They said I shouldn't, said it'd cause chaos. But I said, let the people see. Let them decide. If I was wrong, fine. But hiding it? That was never going to fix anything." Whatever his motives, history would always remember him as the president who cracked open the door. And behind that door, the nation found not a neat answer, but a maze of questions, and the courage to walk through it anyway. Summer brought with it a strange sense of quiet, not of complacency, but of reflection. America, once electrified by the shock of revelation, was now settling into the sobering work of integration. Knowing was one thing. Living with what was known, that was something else entirely. In the hills outside Asheville, North Carolina, a retired CIA operative named Robert Geller came forward with a memoir he'd been writing in secret for years. Titled The Long Game, it traced his decades-long service through operations in Cuba, Southeast Asia, and domestic counterintelligence. But what gripped readers wasn't the admissions of covert action. It was the emotional terrain he laid bare. "I loved my country more than I loved the truth," he wrote. "And when I saw what we were hiding, I told myself it was necessary. For order, for peace, for the greater good. But silence corrodes the soul. And the longer you hold a secret, the heavier it becomes, until it breaks something inside you." Geller's book went viral within a week. Not because it offered new facts, but because it articulated something people had been struggling to say out loud: the trauma of complicity. Suddenly, more operatives, once untouchable figures, were writing, talking, and confessing. Not all were noble. Some tried to reframe their legacies. Others spun half-truths into full-fledged myths. But the cumulative effect was irreversible. The public had stopped looking at the Kennedy assassination as a riddle with one answer. Now it was a mirror, one that reflected every layer of America's post-war psyche: ambition, fear, hope, violence, silence. A massive documentary series called When the Curtain Fell premiered on streaming platforms and cable simultaneously. Hosted by Pulitzer-winning journalist Aaron Choi, it wove together archival footage, testimony, newly declassified documents, and dramatizations of events from the 1940s to the 1980s. Its second episode, titled November's Ghost, focused solely on the JFK assassination and the unraveling of the Warren Commission's authority. It ended with a haunting question: if democracy cannot look at its own reflection, how can it recognize itself? The series triggered a national moment of reevaluation, particularly among those who had grown up in the shadow of Cold War narratives. Letters poured in. Church groups began hosting screenings. High school students interviewed their grandparents, not for assignments, but for answers. And yet, amid the cultural shift, real political battle lines began to emerge. A new political movement surfaced, part libertarian, part populist, part digital native. They called themselves the Clear Light. Their platform was simple: radical transparency, digital oversight of government processes, and citizen access to all historical state archives. "We can't fix what we can't face," their founding document read. "The people are not too fragile for the truth. The government is too fragile to admit it." Within months, Clearlight chapters had opened in 40 states. They fielded candidates in local elections, won several school board seats, and began drafting ballot initiatives to open up state-level archives. They were young, disciplined, and remarkably bipartisan. Of course, backlash followed. Traditional parties accused them of destabilizing institutions. Intelligence agencies leaked memos warning that unchecked document freedom could expose active assets and weaken America's geopolitical positioning. A national columnist likened the movement to surgical honesty performed without anesthesia. But the Clear Light had an answer for every criticism, and most of it came wrapped in code. Using open-source blockchain systems, they developed tools to verify document authenticity, track the timeline of redactions, and flag inconsistencies in official reports. An app called VerifyMeGov allowed anyone to scan a government document and view its revision history. Within 6 months of launch, it had 3 million users. For the first time, truth had an infrastructure. And yet, amid all this advancement, a quieter crisis emerged. Older Americans, those who had lived through the Kennedy era, began reporting increased symptoms of what psychologists were now calling historical dissonance disorder. It wasn't a clinical diagnosis, but rather a framework to understand the emotional dislocation that occurred when foundational beliefs were suddenly inverted. Group therapy sessions popped up in senior centers, not to grieve Kennedy, but to grieve the loss of a stable narrative. One participant, a former schoolteacher named Lillian, wept as she spoke. "I taught my students a lie. For 30 years, I taught them to trust the story. And now I don't know what's real. It feels like I lost my country." In response, a new generation of therapists, clergy, and educators began developing narrative repair models. They weren't trying to fix the past. They were trying to help people live with the truth of it. The phrase, "We're not broken, we're waking up," became a kind of unofficial motto, passed from podcasts to posters to placards. As fall approached again, 2 years after Trump's original release, An anniversary event was held at the newly renamed Kennedy Truth Commons in Boston. It featured poets, scholars, and surviving family members. But the keynote wasn't given by a historian or a politician. It came from Amara Gill, a 17-year-old student from Oakland who had developed a digital archive of Cold War-era student protests. Standing beneath a translucent dome surrounded by projected images of 1960s news clippings, she spoke without notes. "We are not here to reopen wounds. We are here to close them properly. Not with silence, not with shame, but with light." The applause lasted almost 5 minutes. That night, in a hotel suite in New York, a former journalist named Miles Dunham recorded a private message to his grandson. He had been part of the media team that covered the Warren Commission in real time, and for decades had kept quiet about what he had known, what he had omitted. His voice, scratchy and raw, filled the recording. "I didn't lie, not exactly. I just stopped asking questions when it got scary. I want you to know I regret that. But I'm proud of what you're doing now. Keep asking. Don't ever stop." The message, with permission, was later played during the closing moments of When the Curtain Fell's final episode. It became a kind of benediction, a passing of the torch from the generation that had kept secrets to the one determined to uncover them. As the screen faded to black, a final title appeared. "History is not a wound to hide. It's a scar we must carry together." Winter came with snowfall in D.C., gentle but unrelenting, the kind that coated the monuments in white like someone trying to preserve them in time. But America was no longer interested in preservation for its own sake. Not anymore. The story of the Kennedy assassination, once the most mythologized crime in modern history, had morphed into something greater, a doorway to transformation. And now, as the 3rd anniversary of Trump's document release approached, the country stood on the threshold of something it hadn't felt in generations: clarity. Not certainty. Clarity. The difference mattered. In a final act of bipartisan momentum, Congress passed the Public Accountability Reconciliation Act, PARA. It wasn't just about transparency. It was about response. PARA called for a permanent, independent truth commission empowered to investigate suppressed government operations from 1945 to 2001, a national restorative archive to hold testimonies, declassified files, and collaborative timelines built by historians and citizens alike. Annual truth days across public institutions, where students, veterans, civil servants, and survivors shared intergenerational accounts of American secrecy and revelation. The commission wasn't perfect. It wouldn't catch everything. But for many, it marked the end of a long, painful silence. That December, something unexpected happened. A quiet, unmarked envelope was delivered to the Kennedy family estate in Hyannisport. Inside was a single note, typed on aged White House stationery. "Some truths take decades. Some lifetimes. I hope this one helps, even a little." There was no signature, but Caroline Kennedy knew who it was from. She later shared the note, privately at first, then publicly, during a panel at Harvard's JFK School of Government. Standing beside historians and newly released documents, she addressed the room with the composure of someone who had carried legacy and loss like twin weights her entire life. "What we lost in Dallas was not just my father. It was trust. And for decades, we didn't know how to get it back. But now we have something else, proof. And more importantly, the courage to look at it." The room was silent. Some wept. Others nodded. Later that week, a major piece of evidence once thought to be lost, a CIA briefing document dated November 21, 1963, was authenticated and released by the National Archives. It outlined a failed internal attempt to intervene in what had been labeled an imminent threat to the president during his Texas trip. Names were redacted, but timestamps and phrases aligned with previous leaks and confessions. It wasn't the mythical smoking gun, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that the truth had been buried, deliberately, at the highest levels, and that the Warren Commission's report had been compromised before the ink dried. America didn't riot. It breathed. And then, in unexpected ways, it healed. Schools began hosting alternate history workshops, not to speculate recklessly, but to let students imagine how history might have unfolded if transparency had existed sooner. One 10-year-old imagined a world where Kennedy lived and passed sweeping civil rights reforms. Another envisioned a timeline where Vietnam de-escalated under public scrutiny. It wasn't fantasy. It was an exercise in understanding the cost of silence. Art exhibits opened in Detroit, Houston, and Portland. A sculpture of Kennedy walking beside shadows of unidentified men, a physical metaphor for the ambiguity of his legacy, won national acclaim. In Los Angeles, a stage play titled Oswald's Mirror premiered to sold-out audiences. It flipped perspectives, each act, the official story, the conspirator's view, the intelligence agent's angle, the grieving American's silence. The final act had no dialogue, just a long, slow lowering of the curtain while a child on stage read the Bill of Rights aloud. It was haunting, and it was real. Even in politics, a new tone emerged. The Clearlight movement had grown into a legitimate third force in American discourse. While still too young to challenge the duopoly, its ideas began seeping into both parties. Debates now featured terms like legacy truth barriers and civic trauma literacy. Presidential candidates were asked to release their personal archive histories, not for scandal, but for context. America had stopped chasing closure. It was now building understanding. And what of Donald Trump? In an uncharacteristically restrained appearance on a legacy news program, he was asked directly if he regretted releasing the JFK files. He leaned back in the chair, hands folded, an older man now, his bravado tempered, if only slightly. No, I don't regret it. People deserve to know. I didn't do it for history books. I did it because, look, too many things in this country get buried. You shine light on it. Maybe people get mad. Maybe they call you names. But I'd rather be the guy who opened the door than the one who locked it. Whether people believed his sincerity no longer mattered. The act itself had already reshaped the landscape. One final ripple came from an unexpected place. On the island of Guam, an old warehouse once used as a CIA listening station was converted into a museum of forgotten history. Its curator, an unassuming archivist named Joanna Reyes, began collecting oral histories from military families stationed in the Pacific during the 1960s. One testimony, delivered by a now elderly man who had worked in communications, described intercepted chatter in Tagalog referencing a visit that would shake the Americans. The date matched November 1963. Independent linguists and codebreakers began cross-referencing the phrasing with known documents. Patterns emerged. The truth, it seemed, had international roots still unfolding. And the story would continue, not as a secret, but as a shared pursuit. On the third anniversary of the document release, the Truth Commons hosted an all-night vigil. Candles flickered beneath scrolling projections of declassified pages. Volunteers read out portions of the Warren Commission report, then followed with corrections, contradictions, and overlooked footnotes. Music played. Children asked questions. Elders answered. At midnight, the final words of the night were spoken by a woman born in 1963, the same year Kennedy died. She stepped to the mic, voice trembling. They thought the truth would destroy us. But they forgot. We are not made of myths. We are made of questions. And we are strong enough to keep asking. The crowd stood. Some clapped. Some simply held their candles higher, light trembling in the wind. And in that flickering glow, beneath the ghost of a century, a country once fractured by lies stood not as a monument, but as a work in progress. Unfinished, unafraid, unfolding.